In this video, we're going to be looking at Hebrews chapter 12. Chapter 12 goes back and refers back to chapter 11. It starts out by saying we are surrounded by a great cloud of witnesses. Undoubtedly, this is referring back to the people he's mentioned in chapter 11. And he wants us to look back to those great men and women of faith. Look back at what they accomplished. They prove to us that you can indeed live a life of faith. They also show that once you live that life of faith, then you will receive the promises that you're looking for. And based on the fact that those people completed their life of faith, then that showed that we should be able to do it as well. They encourages us to keep going. But how are we going to keep running this life of faith? He compared the life of faith to a race. Now, a race implies suffering. A race implies effort and perseverance. But in order to correctly run this race, we need to lay aside every weight and the sin that easily besets us. You know, in the ancient times, and even sometimes today, when a person is training for a race or some other athletic contest, they may train with extra weights on their arms or their legs. But when they get ready to run a race, then obviously you don't run with weights on. You put them aside because all they're going to do is slow you down. So here the same imagery. Put aside everything that slows you down spiritually. It may include some things that's not necessarily wrong in and of themselves, but things that turn your attention away from God to the things of this world. Put them aside. Put aside every sin. You know, sin is always a problem. Sin is very tempting to us, and for some people, certain sins is more tempting to others. Put aside every sin that so easily ensnares us and distracts us from our duty. Put aside everything that distracts you and prevents you from keeping your eyes on the goal. And run with patience or endurance the race. You know, some races are quick. They're over in just a matter of a few seconds. Other races are more like a marathon. And of course, that's what our race is, isn't it? It's much more like a marathon. It requires a great deal of endurance in order to run this race. This implies struggle. But we must keep running all the way to the very end until life is over. If you quit before the end, then you're just like running a race, but you quit running before the finish line. And if you quit before the finish line, then of course you get nothing. We need to look to Jesus, verse 2. Look to Jesus, the author and finisher of our faith. The author and finisher means that Jesus made the way possible. He also helps us finish the race. Just as you put blinders on horses to prevent them from seeing things away on each side of them, so we need to put blinders on our eyes, so to speak. Keep our eyes on Jesus. As long as our eyes are on Jesus, then we'll be able to continue running. When we take our eyes off Jesus, that's when we have problems. How did Jesus run his race? Well, Jesus looked for the joy that was set before him. The joy means he looked beyond the cross. The cross itself was not joyful. Certainly he did not look forward to that. But he looked for the joy beyond the cross. That is the joy of seeing his loved ones like you and I in heaven with him forever and forever. Because of that joy, he was able to endure the cross and despise or disregard the shame of the cross. You know, we often don't think much about the shame of the cross, but the shame of the cross was very great. It was associated with the very worst criminals and slaves. It was also looked upon as a time of great shame just to even be killed in that way. Even while you're hanging on the cross, men would walk by and they would hurl mockery and ridicule at you while you're hanging there dying. And we know they did that to Christ as well. Come down from the cross and we will believe you. He saved others, but he cannot even save himself. You see, Jesus endured every type of suffering and shame that we have, and more so than that. And yet he remained faithful. He remained true to God. So we need to look to Jesus. And then consider Jesus, verse 3, who endured such hostility, lest we become weary. Consider means to compare. Compare your life and your sufferings with Jesus. And when you do that, what you're suffering is not going to seem like very much. It's going to seem very little. Paul did the same thing in Romans 8, verse 18. For I have reckoned that the sufferings of this present time are not worthy to be compared with the joy that shall be revealed in us. Notice Paul says, when I compare the things of this world and the sufferings I have endured, now Paul endured much more than I ever will, and I'm sure you have too. And yet Paul said, when I compare what I have suffered here with the joy that's waiting for me, well, you really can't compare the two. It's like comparing apples and oranges. I mean, they're just not comparable. Now, Paul could say that. Certainly we can, can't we? Then look at verse 4. You have not yet resisted unto bloodshed. These readers here had not yet faced death. They had not yet had to die for their sin. Now, they faced persecution, yes, but they had not yet died for it. But the danger was very real, and they need to be ready for it. Some others may have escaped persecution because of compromise. And many today want to escape persecution because of compromise as well. So the exhortation found in verses 5 and 6 is found in Proverbs 3, verses 11 and 12, and reminds us of the reason of suffering. You know, sometimes people today think that when we suffer, well, that means God is angry at us. And that means God doesn't love us anymore. Well, here the writer points out, it really may point out the very opposite of that. Now, remember, the author here is not giving us a reason or an explanation for all the sufferings of the world. That doesn't mean that every time something bad happens to us, God is punishing you. But nevertheless, that is one reason. God sometimes does punish us. He does chasten us. But why does he do that? Because he loves us. And because he is training us and testing us so that we can develop greater endurance and greater strength. You see, only opposition and suffering can bring us strength. James 1, verses 3 through 5. There's no suggestion here that the readers here were being punished because of some particular sin in their lives, although that might be part of it too. But God was punishing them and chastening them so that they might grow and become stronger. Verse 6 reminds us of general rule that God rebukes and disciplines his children. God deals with us as children. God has the same care towards us as our physical fathers do towards us. You know, all the children of our loving parents are corrected. You know, sometimes people may say, I love my children so much, I cannot punish them. No, you don't love them too much. You don't love them enough. If you really love your children, you will correct them because you know it's for their benefit. It's the children of illegitimate fathers, that is, children born out of wedlock, that are not disciplined. Usually, fathers of illegitimate children disown them. They show little regard towards them. They avoid all responsibility. Certainly, they certainly do not punish them for some reason. If we are never afflicted by God, then it may indicate that we are not God's children. You see, suffering is not necessarily a curse. It really demonstrates you are sons of God. And he illustrates this principle more fully from the example of earthly parents again. When our earthly parents discipline us, we learn from it and we learn to respect them and honor them because of their love for us and what they've done for us. Now, that doesn't mean we're going to like it. No, we're not going to like it at all. We're not going to be pleasurable. You know, suffering is not pleasurable. I remember when our youngest daughter was very young. You know, at times my wife and I would have to punish her for some reason. And sometimes she would go off and cry and cry to herself and say, no one loves me except my grandmother, my granddaddy, and so forth. Now, as she named off all the ones who loved her, you can rest assured that Mama and Daddy was not on that list. You know, she was angry. She did not like it at all. She thought it meant that we did not love her anymore. But it did mean we loved her. Of course, now she recognizes that and she appreciates it for us. But that just illustrates what earthly fathers do. Now, our earthly fathers does it to the best of their ability. They make mistakes. Sometimes the punishment might be too harsh. Sometimes it might be too lax. Sometimes we punish for reasons that we have when we shouldn't be doing it. We make mistakes. And yet, even though earthly fathers make mistakes, children learn to honor and respect them for that, even with the imperfections. Well, how much more then should we appreciate God? Because God is perfect. He never makes mistakes. Everything he does is for our benefit, and we should learn from that. Therefore, we should respect and honor God because of what he has done for us. As I said, chastening is not joyous, but it causes pain. So religion does not prevent us from all suffering, but the result of it is good. It leads to the fruits of righteousness. It leads to peace and calm. And since there is a purpose in affliction, we need to renew our courage and strength. As it said in verse 12, strengthen your hands that hang down, strengthen your feeble knees. The imagery here is that of a person who is weak and tired. They are exhausted. They're ready to quit. They're ready to give up. They're so discouraged they just can't hardly keep serving God. So he encourages you, don't give up. Keep going. Strengthen your hands. Make paths straight that you walk on. You know, when a person is lame and weak and they can't walk good, then if a surface is very rough, or they will easily trip over that and fall. So he is saying, make your path straight. No, remove everything that might trip you. Move everything that might hinder you. Move everything that might cause you to stumble, so you can have a smooth path to walk on. You know, we do all we can to protect and heal a physical weakness. And we should do the same thing to a spiritual one as well. Every Christian should encourage other Christians. And then in verse 14, pursue peace with all people and holiness. I want to spend just a little bit of time on this verse. I think this is one verse we often overlook, don't think about. Notice he says, first of all, he says, pursue peace with all people, without which no one will see God. This shows us that if we do not seek after peace with all people, we will not see God. Now this is serious, isn't it? How many people in the church that it seem like they delight in causing problems and strife and causing arguments? Well, the writer of Hebrews said, if that's what you do, if you do not pursue peace, which is the opposite of course, having arguments is the opposite of peace. If you do not pursue peace, well, you're not going to see God either. Now, if you do not see God, then obviously you're not going to have a home in heaven. That makes it very serious, doesn't it? Then we also need to pursue holiness. That is a life that is lived in obedience to God. This is the pure heart that Christ talks about in Matthew 5, verse 8. Blessed are the pure in heart, for they shall see God. If both these things are not present, we cannot see God. We cannot enter heaven. And then verse 15, we need to look diligently. To look diligently means to give close and careful attention, lest we fall short of the grace of God. This again indicates a warning against apostasy. If we can never lose our salvation, then why does it really matter if we look diligently or not? The result is going to be the same whether we're diligent or not. So what's the big deal about giving great diligence for something? But the writer said, be careful lest you fall short of the grace of God. Be careful lest a root of bitterness trouble and defile us. This seems to indicate a false teacher that may come up and arise and trouble us, and through his teaching many would be defiled. Then a verse warning is also found in verse 16. Be careful lest you also be like Esau, who was called here a fornicator or profane person. Now the Bible never calls Esau a fornicator. It could indicate he was guilty of spiritual fornication, that is, exalting material things above the spiritual things of more value. Jewish writing did indicate that Esau was very sinful, including being a fornicator. But the point is not whether Esau was really guilty of fornication or not, but the point is that we may become like Esau. We may become a fornicator by exalting material things and unimportant things in place of spiritual things. We can be a profane person by treating the holy things of God as very common and unimportant and insignificant. You see, if a profane person is one who treats religion with contempt and has no sense of spiritual values. And certainly Esau is an example in that respect. Everything in Genesis presents him as a person who was simply living for the moment. He was only concerned with the present times. He was not thinking about the future time at all. But yet, according to verse 17, when it came time for the blessing, Esau desperately wanted that blessing, but it was too late. When it came time for the blessing, he really wanted to be blessed by his father Isaac, but once Isaac had made the blessing, he could not take it back. You see, once God pronounces a judgment, it cannot be changed. We're going to be judged on the basis of this life. Once death comes, after that's only the judgment and nothing can be changed. I have read a few people say, with some measure of pride, that they're not worried about the next life. They're not worried about heaven or hell or any of those things because they're so confident of their ability to handle it and make good out of bad things that whatever it is, if there's heaven, if there's a hell, whatever it is, they'll handle it then and they can make do with it. Well, that's a very foolish way to live. The Bible points out that once this life is over, our judgment is sealed and there's nothing we can do about it. We cannot change it after this life. We cannot handle that on our own. Only God can do that. And now beginning in verse 18, we have a great encouragement. You have not come to the mountain, that is physical Mount Sinai, that might be burned with fire into blackness and darkness and the tempest and the sound of the trumpets and the voice of words, so fearful that even the ones who heard it pleaded that they would not be spoken to them anymore. When Moses was on Mount Sinai and he received the 10 Commandments and the law, that mountain, of course, was covered with smoke and thunderings and fire. There was a great earthquake. The people heard the sound of the trumpet. They heard the voice of God speaking to them, but the voice itself was so fearful, they prayed that God would not speak to them anymore. All of that stressed how unapproachable God was at that time. Notice that in the Old Testament, when God spoke to human beings, usually they were so afraid they wanted God to quit speaking. But today, many claim that God speaks to them and they act as if it's just very commonplace. Sometimes they even speak back with God, maybe even argue with him to some extent, just like you and I might speak to one another. In the old days, people were terrified of God, and the very presence of God terrified the people. It was so terrifying on Mount Sinai, the people did not want God to speak to them anymore. It was so holy that the mountain was holy, that even if an animal touched the mountain, then that animal should be killed from a distance, that is, by stoning or by an arrow. The sight was so terrible and awesome that according to verse 21, even Moses was terrified. Now, this statement is not found by Moses in Exodus. In Deuteronomy 9:19, after Moses had broken the tables of stone, Moses said he was afraid of God. Stephen said in Acts chapter 7, verse 32, that Moses shook with fear. So this indicates that even Moses was afraid of God. If even the righteous Moses was afraid of God, no wonder the rest of Israel was terrified. But again, if even the righteous Moses was terrified of the presence of God, then how can we today claim that God speaks to us and act as if it's a very lovely thing, an enjoyable thing, and it's nothing at all? No, we need to have a measure of respect for God. Remember that God is still God and we're human beings. And then come to verse 22 and 23. We find 8 things that we have come to under this new covenant, which illustrates the great blessings that we have under this new covenant. We have now come to Mount Sinai, or Mount Zion. We have not come to a physical mountain, but we've come to a spiritual mountain. A reference to the dwelling place of God, because Mount Sinai stands for the city of God, the dwelling place of God. We've now come to a heavenly city, New Jerusalem. This is a reference to the church, the body of Christ. We have come with an innumerable company of angels, which reminds us of the angels that attended God at the giving of his law. Now, we're not worshiping the angels here, but we've come with the angels to worship God. We've come to a general assembly and the church of the firstborn. The word assembly is used nowhere else in the New Testament, and it refers to a gathering of the people to honor a god or for some public festival. So we've assembled with the things of the Old Testament. We've assembled with the church to honor God, whose names have been registered in heaven. Registration established one's identity as a citizen, so that you could receive the benefits and the privileges of citizenship. To have our names recorded in the book of life means that we are citizens of Christ's kingdom. And the writer said we are now members of that kingdom. We are citizens of that kingdom. Our names have been written in the book of life. Oh, that should be a source of great joy to us. We've come to God, who is the judge of all. We've also been united with all the righteous one made perfect. Undoubtedly, this refers to all those before Christ of the Old Testament time period, who were made perfect by the blood of Christ. We also come to Jesus, the mediator of a new covenant. He is the guarantee of a better covenant. Christ's blood sealed this better covenant and cleanses our sins. And we've come now to his blood, the blood of sprinkling, the blood that washes away our sins. That's what we've come to. A blood that calls for forgiveness, not like the blood of Abel, which calls for vengeance. And now we come to verse 25. Great encouragement, but yet also a great warning. See that you do not refuse him who speaks. Why? Because if those who disobeyed under the old law, that is, those who spoke from the earth, Moses spoke a law that was given by God, but yet they came from a physical mountain, given through a physical human being. If you disobeyed that law, you were punished. Now, if you were punished by disobeying that law, how much more would you be punished if you disobeyed a law spoken not by a human being, but by the very Son of God, and a law that was given from God? when God spoke in Mount Sinai, the mountain quake. And well, in verse 26, he again promised, in 26 and 27, he talks about what happened on that mountain, how the mountain did shake, and how that Haggai chapter 2 in verse 6 prophesied about the coming of Christ and all the things are going to take place there. Now, when he talks about this, shaking the earth and so forth, he's not talking about the end of the world and the second coming of Christ. He's talking about the first coming. He's talking about all the things that's going to take place when Christ came the first time and his kingdom is established. It's not a literal shaking, although there was a great earthquake at that time, but he's talking about the great change and revolution that's going to affect the whole earth, and how that the Jewish economy and everything about the Jewish system of religion was going to be taken away so that the permanent things could come and remain. All of the other things were going to be removed because they were temporary. The old law was never intended to last forever. But now the Christ has come. He's shaken that system to its very foundation so that now those things that can remain are now here. Those things referring to the gospel, the church, and all the spiritual things. And now look at verse 28. Therefore, since we are receiving a kingdom which cannot be shaken. Again, this shows it that we are now members of that kingdom. These people were members of that kingdom. They became a member of it according to Colossians 1 verse 13 when they obeyed Christ. We have been translated out of the kingdom of darkness into the kingdom of his dear Son. Therefore, since we are part of a kingdom, let us have grace. That phrase, let us have grace, could also be translated, let us be thankful. Indeed, thankfulness is a reason why and motivation for us to serve God in a proper way. That to serve God with reverence and godly fear. Serve God with fear and reverence. Now, the fear here is not fear as if you fall down just deadly afraid of God, but it's the honor, respect, and devotion to God. We serve God out of reverence and honor. The worship is, service here would include worship, but it's not just worship. It includes other things in that. And then verse 29 gives us a reason why we serve God with reverence and godly fear. Because our God is a consuming fire. This is a quotation from Deuteronomy 4 and verse 24. And this shows that we serve the same God that the people of the Old Testament period served. Because the writer of Hebrews uses this verse to show that our God is the same as their God. Moses wrote in Deuteronomy, our God is a consuming fire. Now, the New Testament doesn't stress the wrath of God. On the other hand, the New Testament stresses the great love of God. But nevertheless, even though the New Testament stresses the love and the kindness and the goodness of God, we always need to remember there's another side of God. God also is a God of punishment and wrath. And God does show great wrath and punishment upon those that are not obedient, those that are not his children. You see, even though we are under the New Testament, which does stress the love of God, never forget the other side. You see, there's so many people today, all they ever think about is the love of God and the goodness of God. And they will say, well, God is so loving and kind, I don't have to worry about it. God is not going to punish anyone. God is not going to send anyone to hell. We don't have to worry about going to hell because our God loves us. Well, it's true that God does love us. But we also remember that God is also a consuming fire. God is a God of wrath upon the disobedient. God is a God of wrath upon those who refuse to become part of his family, his church, his children. Never forget the other side of God. So that winds up our discussion of chapter 12. We have one more chapter, and then we'll finish the book of Hebrews. Thank you.